Get your ticket for Monerotopia in Mexico City on May 5th, 6th, and 7th, 2023. That's monerotopia.com to get for more info. Welcome to the party, pal. I have John Ziegler, who does the podcast called Death of Journalism. He's been in journalism for a long time. I first noticed him back on Channel 9 in Steubenville, Ohio, when he did sports for them. So that was over 30 years ago. How are you? And he's in California now today. So how you doing, John?
I'm all right, Chris. That was a very, very long time ago.
Yes, it was. So how did you get into journalism, and how did you end up where you are today in Los Angeles doing your Death of Journalism podcast?
Well, that's a very, very long story, but the short version of it is that I was a sportscaster growing up. I wanted to be a sportscaster, and then that's how I ended up at WTOV in Steubenville, Ohio, Wheeling, West Virginia, the NBC affiliate there, where, among other things, I had a news anchor co-host by the name of Liz Habib, who I would end up doing not one, but for a short period of time, 2 podcasts with here in Los Angeles. And I wanted to be a sportscaster, one, because I love sports, and 2, because I didn't think I was smart enough to be a newscaster, because at the time I delusionally thought that sportscasters were smart, which clearly they're not. I mean, the newscasters are smart. Neither sportscasters nor newscasters are particularly bright. It would take me a while to figure that out. But eventually I realized I was too controversial for corporate sports media and went into political talk radio and a whole bunch of other things, and then documentary films, and then podcasting and investigative journalism. And I guess over the last 15 years or so, I've been particularly horrified by what I see as a fundamental shift in the nature of the news media, how broken it is, and how willing they are to just lie and allow things that are untrue to be perceived as true, and to criticize things that are actually true as misinformation, or to censor them completely, as we saw certainly during the COVID panic. And it's gone so far just beyond the normal political bias that I think it's a real threat to the essence of our country. I think the country is in grave, grave danger for a lot of reasons, but this is one of them. And so twice a week, I do a podcast called The Death of Journalism. We release it on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings. And it's pretty unique. And it basically is the result of some 30, 35 years of experience throughout every different aspect of the news media that I have, I've experienced myself, and I share those experiences. And I think it gives me a pretty unique ability to analyze what's actually going on in the world, and deciphering it for people who have not lived it for the last 35 years as I have.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We've certainly seen a lot of changes in media. I mean, when you were on Channel 9, the internet was still largely confined to colleges. So what have been the most disturbing trends, and how do you think we got to this place?
Well, I think that the big picture answer is that technology and economics changed. And by the way, the technology changed the economics. And when you change the technology and the economics, then all sorts of things change. The incentive structure changes dramatically, for one thing. I mean, the short history of news media is that back in the heyday, news media outlets did broadcasting. And then once fragmentation hit, they were forced into narrowcasting. And then when more fragmentation hit and the business model completely shattered, they were forced into cult casting. And now I think we're heading into something what I call narrow cult casting, where basically you're much better off focusing your attention and providing content designed for a very small group, a relatively small group of very passionate people, and telling them what they want to hear rather than what the truth is. And that's how you can survive economically. Broadcasting is dead. And so now the media has basically separated us out into 1,000 different silos, where people are getting completely different versions of reality. all designed so that, any media outlet can survive by targeting a particular demographic as opposed to the population as a whole. And that to me is the big picture and the biggest problem, because that has caused all sorts of problems, including the fact that, taking this out of the theoretical and bringing it into the practical, left-wing media outlets no longer even have to care about providing the conservative side of things, because they know that the conservative audience is no longer part of their target demographic. The conservative audience is not consuming their information. So why bother even trying to be fair? It's far more in their self-interest to just tell liberals what they want to hear, because that's the only way they can hang on to their ever-shrinking audiences. And so it's the technology broke the business model, and the business model breaking broke the essence of newscasting. And when you're doing therapy for a target demographic, you're not telling them the truth, and you're not accountable for any screw ups, whether intentional or accidental. And oh, by the way, the other part of the economics is that you don't have the manpower or the woman power, whatever, to do news properly, because to do news properly takes a lot of time and effort and resources, and that's gone now, because there aren't the resources, there aren't the people, and instead those that still have jobs are tasked with feeding the monster on a constant basis, and it's all based upon what they think is going to be popular with their target demographic, especially on social media, which is all about likes and retweets and views, and it's not about truth. And so the entire situation is broken, fundamentally broken, and it's only going to get worse, because this younger generation coming up has absolutely no institutional memory of the way things used to be or ought to be. They're not being taught properly in colleges, that's for sure. And they think that, in all seriousness, they think that if a story is popular, doesn't matter how untrue it might be, that is a good story. And as soon as popularity is the coin of the realm and truth has no meaning, then we're done. And that's pretty much where we are right now.
Yeah, it seems that way. And of course, you probably grew up in the same house as I did. Our TV went from channel 2 to channel 13. And maybe you only had one TV in the house.
Well, yeah, that was the era, I guess in retrospect was the golden era of broadcasting, where on television, television used to be the greatest uniting force probably in the history of the country, where, so much of America would be tuned to the same thing at exactly the same time. Now, radio might have done that at one point, but television had a unique ability to do it, and it's far more powerful medium, obviously, because it's visual. And, through into the 1990s, that was pretty much the way things were. And then the internet happened, and cable news exploded, and all that changed. And media outlets went from being a license to print money. It almost didn't matter how successful you were. If you were a network television station or a major radio station or a newspaper, it was almost impossible to lose money, just by virtue of the fact that you had very little competition, and what you were providing was inherently of so much value to the population. And so oftentimes the news departments were under zero pressure to actually make money. It was mostly a prestige thing. And so you could, and an obligation to society type of endeavor. So you could spend all sorts of money trying to pursue really good stories, and that was the coin of the realm. How good was your news product, not how popular it was with a target demographic. And unfortunately, as I've already articulated, the reality is that that's all they care about now. And they are, basically we have the tail wagging the dog, because it used to be that, the audience only had a few options, and so the media outlet could tell a story that they knew part of their audience wasn't going to like, because they knew it was the truth and it was good journalism. And, if a few people were offended, they had nowhere else to go, and it didn't matter anyway, because we're still going to make money. Well, now that's completely gone. And the reality is that they need to, basically the inmates, the viewers or the listeners or the readers are running the asylum, because they have all the power. Because if they get offended, they can go wherever else they want, because there's another flavor that's very similar to the flavor that they've been consuming across the street. And so it's a very damaging situation. And by the way, it's the same on the right as it is on the left. In fact, in some ways, it's worse on the right than it is on the left. And it's disgusting, and it's really impacting our politics, especially when it comes to presidential politics. And it's not for the good.
Yeah, and not to mention now that when you were at Channel 9, you knew the news was on at 11 o'clock. It was on Channel 7 at 11 o'clock. There wasn't this race to be first. You both knew you were going to be on at 11 o'clock, so you weren't trying to be the one to get out there first. You might take more time to do fact checking or stuff like that. Is that fair to say too?
Time plays a big role in all of this. I mean, obviously, human beings are inherently flawed, and if human beings are rushed to do anything, they're not going to do as good a job as if they have more time. And inherently, human beings are terrible reporters. Even reporters are terrible reporters. We're just not very good at it. Play a game of Whisper Down the Lane, and you can see for yourself just how bad human beings are at reporting what they have seen or heard or whatever it is that is happening. So time plays a role in all this, and I think also the other role that time plays is our attention spans. Our attention spans are so short now. We expect everything instantly, and whatever hits as the first narrative has an enormous power, because it dictates everything else that gets said and perceived after that. And that initial narrative is often created with either bad information or not much information. I mean, heck, where we're speaking right now, we don't even know what the heck is in the indictment against Donald Trump in New York. And, most people, I think, are understandably very, very skeptical of it. I'm very skeptical of it, but we don't even know what the hell is in it. And yet so much of that narrative has already been created, because we live in a world where we expect everything now. And, and the other part of the attention span thing is, especially television news. I would say in the olden days, you might be able to get away with a 3-minute, if it was a really important story, a 3-minute news story. Today, you can't even get away with a 30-second news story. I mean, in all seriousness, major news stories, they probably don't even give you a minute, including intro and the full news story, because they know from overnight television ratings down to the minute, that people will start to doze off and change the channel if they're not into the story. So they have to keep things happening, and you cannot tell a substantive news story in a minute. I mean, you can barely do it in 3 minutes, but you certainly can't do it in a minute. And that's, unfortunately, the world we're living in now, and I think there's a symbiotic relationship. I think the more that the public's attention span has shrunk, the more the news media has shrunk news. And the more the media has shrunk news, the more the public's attention span has shrunk. And that's how we get TikTok. We get, millions of views for things that are like 18 seconds long on TikTok. And I'm like, what the hell was that? How the hell did that get 8 million views? And that's the world we live in now.
Yeah. John, I know you've probably not spent much time in newspapers, but what about, newspapers and the death of classified ads? I mean, Craig Newmark basically destroyed newspapers when he created Craigslist.
Yeah, that's been accepted as kind of the conventional wisdom as to what happened. I think it's probably more complex than that. But yes, most people did not understand that classified ads were the bread and butter of newspapers. And they sold advertising, but classified ads was a steady stream of income that if you think about it, was far more reliable than, say, corporate ads, because a corporate ad might be sensitive to content, right? But a classified ad is not going to be sensitive to content. No one is going to blame someone who runs a classified ad for any content that's in the newspaper, or no one who runs a classified ad is going to think that they have any control over the news content of a newspaper. So it was kind of like free money for a newspaper, without any obligation, without any concerns about conflict of interests or anything like that. By the way, the other element of this is inherently, if you're in a city and you have major businesses advertising in your newspaper, you're eventually going to have to report on that business. All right. If it's a big enough business, something is likely to happen from a news standpoint involving them. And that's a conflict of interest that doesn't exist in the classified ad situation. And so when Craigslist came around and classified ads effectively dried up, that caused a big problem. And now with the internet, I frankly think the internet caused a bigger problem, because the internet basically taught people that the newspaper should be free. And, because for a long time, the internet was totally free. And it's only been fairly recently that the New York Times and the Washington Post and some others that think they can get away with it have gone to almost a full subscription-based model. Now, it was always subscription when it was delivered to your home, but it felt different. I mean, it felt almost like it was a utility at that time. Almost everybody got a newspaper delivered to their home, and it was only a few cents a day, and it's still only a few cents a day. But I'm psychologically, even I don't think I've ever paid for a newspaper subscription, simply because philosophically, I was against it on the internet.
Yeah.
And and so it is a pain in the ass, because you only get a few articles a month in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and occasionally you'll have to figure out some backdoor way to find out what was actually in an article. But I think the internet, because it created so much competition, and it also devalued the number of views. Like, for instance, and I mean, this gets complicated, but it's far less valuable in the internet age for 100,000 people to view a page on your internet than it would have been to have 100,000 people view a physical piece of paper in the old newspaper days. You see what I'm saying? So that also hurt the business model. The value per click or view on the internet is not as valuable as the olden days, when someone had a newspaper sitting there in front of them all day long, or maybe several days long, and had a much more intimate experience with that piece of paper. So that also hurt the business model. But yeah, I mean, newspapers have collapsed, and the number of newspaper reporters, my God, I don't know what the numbers are, but the number of people today being employed as quote unquote newspaper reporters of mainstream, legitimate publications has to be a small fraction of what it was in the 1970s, 80s, or even 90s. This has to be a small fraction. And by the way, as someone who hates what the news media has become, even I think that is a terrible development, because they play an important role. And especially on the local level, I mean, my God, there must be so much corruption going on in smaller cities, especially, if it's by liberals who know that they're protected by whatever local media there is. There has to be enormous amounts of corruption going on, because they know there's no watchdog anymore. and that any watchdog that there is basically been declawed, because every individual member of the news media has far less power than they used to have. I mean, the only time the news media really still has significant power is when they all work together in unison constantly 24/7 for an extended period of time, which we have seen, recently with COVID. That was really the most recent example of when that happens. But it took an international pandemic for that to occur. And so, I there's no question to me that the loss of newspapers is a very negative situation. And by the way, so because of that, because the business model is broken, the New York Times, for instance, which is still the paper of record and still dictates a lot of coverage in a lot of other media outlets, the New York Times is beholden to a very woke subscriber base. And they now routinely change headlines and sentences and stories, not because they're untrue, but because they offended their woke subscriber base. I mean, and this happens constantly now, and that's a major problem, and it's indicative of a much bigger problem than even that.
Yeah, but also, John, something else I thought of, thinking about the consolidation of media. I grew up in Moundsville, West Virginia, which isn't far from Steubenville, but Moundsville still actually has a 5-day-a-week newspaper printed in the town that is not owned by any big corporation or anything. The printing press is right there in their building. The Austin American Statesman in Austin, Texas, is printed in San Antonio. I mean, what can you say about the consolidation of the news media, where now every newspaper, every TV station, or every radio station is not owned locally, but owned by some big corporation like News Corp or Clear Channel or something like that?
Well,
how has that impacted things?
Well, that happened largely because of the changing economics. That was the way to streamline expenses. Gannett was a huge part of this within the newspaper world. They most notably own USA Today, but they also own a bazillion local newspapers. And so the thought was, well, if we can provide all these local outlets their national news for free, because it's all the same stuff that basically you're getting from the same people that do USA Today, and then therefore all they have to worry about is the local stuff, then you've more efficiently created a more efficient business model. But even that has broken down, and Gannett has had a massive amount of layoffs across the country lately, and I think it's a shame. Your local municipality ought to matter, and because things happen there, and there's no other way to be covered. I mean, you have to have local news. Otherwise, as I've already referenced, you're going to have a massive amount of corruption, for one thing, because if you're local enough, everyone is going to presume that you can get away with it, because otherwise no one's going to know about it. So, yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that happened because of the broken business model that I think harmed not just news, but also the identity of a community. I mean, forget about the really serious hard news stuff. Think about in our generation how important it was for like a kid to get his picture in the newspaper, right? Or his name in the newspaper, or to read about your local high school, or or what somebody in your local town did that was great. That's all. A lot of that's gone now. It's not even part of the mentality, I'm sure. I mean, heck, my daughter doesn't even think about being in the local paper. She thinks about being mentioned by her, dreaming about being mentioned by her favorite YouTuber. That's the dream today, and I think there's something lost in that. It's a shame.
Yeah, I never thought of that. It's interesting too to think that you might have more corruption locally because there's nobody covering it. But at the same time, sometimes the local newspapers do end up covering up for the local corruption. I've certainly seen that happen, where sometimes a local scandal will actually get broken by the newspaper in the town that's 50 miles away or something like that. It's,
Well,
you
all
know,
the incentive structure is all upside down now. So yeah, I mean,
yeah,
if the corruption is by someone who's an advertiser, then they're probably not going to cover it because it's not worth it to them. Their
yeah.
main goal is to maintain financial viability.
Yeah. So, yeah. But do you think there's a different, but you've also probably noticed differences though in how local news will cover something versus national news. I mean, yeah, something like usually when I hear about something, I always look up a local outlet. Like when Arnold Palmer died, I went to the Pittsburgh TV stations and saw what they said about Arnold Palmer instead of going to ESPN because they knew him better than ESPN did. What do you think about that? Do you think maybe people should try to go local if they want to find out about something that's happened as opposed to CNN or the national outlets?
Well, I'm a big believer in local. I think inherently, oftentimes, the local people know more about what's going on than the national people. I mean, the national people, they're not there. They probably maybe have never been there. They're very, very superficial in their understanding or their coverage. I would say maybe there have been some good things about the advent of massive technology, and I guess one of the few good things is that it's a lot easier to access what's happening in a local market today than it used to be. I mean, all you got to do is go on the internet and you can find out what's happening in any particular city where what's left of the news media there, how they are covering a particular event that is central to them. And so I guess that's good. I used to live in Nashville. We just had the horrible Nashville shooting, and in the old days, I would have had to ask my friends that are still there, how's the local media covering this thing? And then now I can just pretty much look at it myself. And so that's changed too.
But that's the thing. You can just go up and look up Nashville news and watch what they're saying because usually I don't know, they're not going to, I hope that they're not going to have as much of a bias though, because they have to cover things and they have to, because they know these people, they know the area, and they know they probably knew people who went to that school and knew other people. So yeah, it's definitely something you want to keep going. Yeah. So how do you think we get out of this?
I am not optimistic for how we get out of this. I think it's only going to get worse for reasons I've already stated, which are that more and more older people are going to get out of the business, and more younger people are going to get into the business, and fewer jobs are going to be available. I mean, I actually think it has to get much worse before it ever theoretically gets repaired. To me, about the only thing that could happen, and this would be terrible and probably not worth it, but I mean, we would have to have an economic depression of epic proportions to wipe out the current media landscape and to basically start over again. I mean, that's the only scenario I see, and I'm not rooting for that. But I really don't see a scenario that can fix this. I mean, we've had so many situations recently that should have been a wake-up call for the news media, most notably COVID, for where they blew it completely and damaged so many lives unnecessarily, all for an agenda and a narrative that were not based in truth. And there's been no accountability. There's only more and more lack of trust. I mean, the lack of trust is just astonishing and understandable. But I mean, there are conservatives, especially, who don't believe anything that gets said, at all, no matter, even if it's 100% true. And that is incredibly unhealthy and dangerous. And so, I mean, to me, to have any chance of fixing this, there has to be some accountability first. And there has to be accountability for, people in the media to say, we screwed up. Here's why we screwed up. Here's what we're going to try to fix to make sure it doesn't happen again. We apologize. I'd like to hear the words, we apologize occasionally. We never hear that. We never hear I was wrong or we were wrong. That never happens. And so, the egos alone, I don't think allow for any sort of process for this to be fixed to even start.
Yeah. John, how much of a role do the journalism schools and the elite colleges play in all this? I suspect it's a huge role, but what do you think?
Well, Liz Habib, who we've already referenced, my former podcast co-host and former anchor co-host, I guess, in Steubenville, Ohio, 30 some years ago. She is taught at two different very elite journalism colleges, Syracuse University and Arizona State's Walter Cronkite School. And she was horrified by what she saw. I don't want to speak for her, but every stereotype that conservatives might have about the nature of academia, she found to be 100% true, and that these kids are incredibly woke and wussified and soft and entitled and clueless about the nature of journalistic ethics and really only caring about popularity and wanting to be famous. And this is just a recipe for further disaster, because at least now there's some institutional memory that still exists within the mainstream news media. There's still some people that are old enough and have a soul, at least, that go, hey, wait a minute, this isn't really the way we're supposed to do this. But I think in 10 years or so, that's going to be basically gone, and it's going to be totally dominated by a bunch of 20 and 30 somethings and even 40 somethings that have no institutional memory of the 80s or 90s, the last time before this thing went off the rails. And so, as I've said several times, I think it's only going to get worse. And let's face it, I mean, the people teaching journalism school are all incredibly liberal. Most of them are not successful, which is why they're in teaching journalism school. Not all, but many. And but most importantly, they're very, very liberal. And and I mean, heck, Liz told me a story about how these kids now think that the way to determine the validity and the importance of a news story is purely by its online popularity and via algorithms. And I mean, it's just horrifying stuff that is so against the what was supposed to be the nature of journalism. So yeah, the so-called journalism schools are not helping this situation at all.
Yeah, and there is this issue too, though, that you see some of these things that are all over CNN and they're just not that important. I mean, one thing comes to mind was that girl Natalie Holloway who went down to Aruba, and it was all over CNN for weeks. And granted, I don't watch CNN much, but I don't really watch CNN, but I always see CNN on when I go to Gold's Gym. And the only thing that made that story disappear was Hurricane Katrina. And I said, well, at least Hurricane Katrina is real news as opposed to just one girl going to Aruba and disappearing.
Well, I agree that Natalie Holloway, although that was a long, long time ago now, because I was on the air in Los Angeles as a talk show host at that time. And I agree that Natalie Holloway was a seminal moment. I actually think it happened before Natalie Holloway. And I think it was more Fox News Channel than it was CNN.
Yeah.
To me, it was Fox News Channel that really, and Greta Van Susteren, who really jumped all over Natalie Holloway, which was not a news story, but it was a story that got ratings during a slow news period because it was every parent's worst nightmare. And you had a pretty blonde girl who disappears and is very likely murdered by potentially a good-looking rich kid in a foreign country. And this on spring break, I mean, this is they realized that this was a hit. That's all this is. They focus group now. Basically they do it for a night or two, and they look at the ratings and they focus group it and they go, "We've got a hit here." I actually think Scott Peterson was the first of this kind of story. Scott Peterson, who murdered his wife, his pregnant wife, a few years before Natalie Holloway, and he was good looking, she was good looking. The story was great, and the media realized it was a hit, and then they pretended that this had never happened before. Man had never killed his pregnant wife before. Not that makes it not a news story, but certainly not a massive national obsession. I mean, Scott Peterson was not known before this, nor was his wife Lacey, and there was no special significance to it. It's just a story that hit in the ratings, and this is the type of thing that the news media didn't have to do. They didn't have to do this previously. There was no need to jump on these types of stories previously, but now they have to, because otherwise, in lulls in the news cycle, they're not going to have the ratings to be able to survive this broken business model. And so this is the temptation now that exists, and we're seeing it most recently. That horrible situation that happened was in, I can't even remember now, South Dakota with Idaho. The Idaho murders over late last year. We saw that similarly horrible situation where 4 people are killed. It's terrible, but that thing got massive amounts of news coverage because you have 4 attractive college kids getting murdered in a very strange way. And so once you get a large enough audience of people that are invested in a story, especially one that has a legal process that you can continue to hook them into for a long period of time, we're always looking for the next OJ, right? I mean, there's never going to be another OJ. I mean, unless Trump murders a couple people during the process of the 2024 election, but we're never going to see another OJ Simpson, and they're always looking for a mini OJ. And so that's what this is really about. So OJ broke the mold, and then Scott Peterson showed what they could get away with, and then Natalie Holloway confirmed what they could get away with, and we've basically been living in that world ever since.
Yeah, they actually interrupted the NBA Finals for that Bronco chase, and one thing I remember, there were a lot of basketball fans were really upset about that. Because they wanted to watch the Knicks, But anyway, but it's also interesting too, John. We have this 24 hours news cycle now, and stations that are dedicated to news, and you've got to fill that time with something. So it almost seems like now you can go and make this and obsess over this story that maybe wouldn't have gotten nearly as much of attention in the days, when you only had 12 stations on the TV.
Well, that's a big part of it. Yeah, I mean, when you have when you have several 24-hour news channels, they need content, and so that's very difficult. And that's why OJ was such a godsend, because it was ready-made content for a year and a half. They didn't have to do anything for a year and a half, and they got tremendous ratings. That's always the dream. I mean, free ratings with little work. And big audiences and salacious content. That's partially why we got Donald Trump. Donald Trump was in 2016 or 2015, 2016 was basically the political OJ Simpson. That's effectively what it was. Yeah. And we're seeing a repeat of that in 2024. It looks like. So I mean, that's unfortunately the way it works. This is the nature of the business model now.
John, I wanted to get onto the Trump phenomena, because you have a very objective way of looking at Trump. And when you talk about reality TV, I'm reminded of something that Jack Hunter said about Trump before he was president. He said, Trump really would be one of my favorite wrestlers if he wasn't running for president. And that's basically what politics has become. It's become like, studio wrestling. What do you make of the whole Trump phenomena?
Well,
because as you said, you're one of the few never Trumpers who did not sell out on COVID, and I have immense respect for that.
Well, I appreciate you recognizing that, because I am truly one of the very few never, and maybe the only never Trumper that didn't sell out on COVID or on Brett Kavanaugh, for instance, or really on the Russian Gate situation. I mean, I believe, remained very, very objective about Donald Trump. I talk about Trump a lot on my podcast. I loathe him. I have always loathed him. My father dealt with him pretty extensively back in the late 80s and early 90s, and I think had some insight into who he really was, both as a business person and as a human being. I think he's a terrible person. I think he's a liar. I think he's a fraud. I think he was a terrible president when it mattered, which was when we first had a crisis, which was COVID. I think he crapped the bed, and I think he rolled around in his own feces for the next year. And I think the country was forever damaged because of it. I think he trusted the wrong people. I think he was naive. And he put Dr. Fauci on television and made him a superstar. And then he didn't fight back. And then he attacked people who tried to open up, like the governor of Georgia and Sweden. And now he's trying to pretend that Ron DeSantis didn't actually do the right thing. I mean, he's just a terrible person. And look, I understand his appeal, to the Trump voter. It's interesting. His unofficial slogan for this election seems to be, "I am your retribution," which is just a horrifying political slogan. I am your retribution. But I actually think that this was pretty well thought out on his part, because he is speaking for a lot of people who are very angry at the system, because their lives didn't turn out the way that they had hoped or expected or they thought they were promised. And so they want a pound of flesh. They don't care about the issues. They don't care about his ability to get anything done. They don't care about his policies even. They just want someone who is going to stick it in the eye or the ear or the ass of whatever they think is the establishment, which is hilarious because he's former president and the Republican front runner. He's basically the establishment now, but that's what they want. They are angry and they want a pound of flesh, and they think that Trump can give that to them, and he can't, but that's what they think. And Trump is really incredible at manipulating the news media. He is a savant at that. Sometimes he does it simply by accident, but he is very, very good at it. And the media plays right into it. And they're going to play into it again in 2024, just like they did in 2016. Only I think this time the more likely scenario is that he loses the general election, and then we end up with another 4 to 12 years of Biden and Harris, and the country just simply can't survive that.
Yeah. Even before Trump was president, I remember thinking that he was, if you ever watched Rocky and Bullwinkle, there was this series on the Pottsylvania creeper. It was this plant that was a man-eating plant. And it gets to this point where Rocky says, "We've tried everything except putting that thing to bed." And then they said, "That's it. Be nice to the plant." And then suddenly everybody starts being nice to the plant and the plant dies. I wonder what would happen if the news media would just start saying, "Oh, Donald Trump is such a charismatic leader," or "Donald Trump is, he's looking very presidential today." Do you think that might take the wind out of Trump's sails?
Well, I've heard a lot of analogies and metaphors about Trump. I haven't heard that one, but I get where you're going with that. I think there's something to be said for the idea that Trump feeds off of negative media coverage. I don't think it's possible at this point for that to happen, because the left-wing media has created so much hatred of Trump among their audience that if they were ever nice to them, their audience would revolt against them and then go to other liberal media outlets that were properly fomenting hate against Trump. And so that's not going to happen. Although weirdly though, I think we're beyond that. I think if that had happened at a different time, that might have had more of an impact. But his core, his cult, is so able to rationalize everything that if, let's say, he started getting praise in the mainstream news media, the cult would say, "Aha! See, we told you. Even the New York Times is praising our man now. Even the Washington Post, even NBC. Yeah, I mean, they would use it as validation for how awesome he is. I mean, there's really nothing that can happen at this point, and that the only question is, how large of a percentage is that of the Republican voting base? And I don't know the answer to that. If you told me for sure that it was over 40%. I would tell you that Trump is for sure going to be the nominee. If you told me for sure it was under 40%, I would tell you this thing is going to be a hell of a battle and he could very easily lose. My guess is it's over 40%, but I don't know that for sure yet.
But, this is an interesting phenomena of the Trump cult, as you call it. A lot of the people that I know that are part of the Trump cult were very upset about all of these corona policies. And it's like, why are you ignoring the fact that he really made coronavirus the news media sensation that it was? How can you block that out?
I've thought a lot about this, and I think I have the answer, which is basically the people have forgotten. And they've rationalized their memory, and I think to the extent that Trump is doing better against DeSantis in the polls, that's the very simple answer. People are forgetting about COVID. Anger about COVID is slowly fading. They're forgetting about the midterms and how great DeSantis did and how poorly Trump did. Trump is kind of like, to use a metaphor, I think Trump is kind of like that family vacation that you keep taking year after year because you forget a year later all the bad stuff. You filter out all the bad stuff that happened and you only remember, some of the good things that might have occurred. And it seems like a good idea. So you go again the next year until you go, wait a minute, this is exactly what happened last year. And so there's no question that when you are a member of a cult, part of what happens is that your memory gets impacted, and your brain, I think, automatically filters out negative information and then rationalizes it too if you haven't forgotten about it. I mean, I can't tell you how many people on Twitter, Trump fans, who say, well, it might have been bad what Trump did with Fauci, but he had no choice. He would have gotten destroyed no matter what he did. He was in a no-win situation, all of which is not true, by the way.
Yeah.
But they're willing to rationalize it in any way they possibly can. Or, if all else fails, they can always say, well, he's learned his lesson, and what's the chances that there's going to be another pandemic anyway? So, and I'm like, okay, I don't know what else you can do at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, look, there's been a lot of pretty simple choices politically in my life, but there's never been a more simple one, more obvious one than whether or not you go with this Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump, if only by virtue of the fact that Trump can only serve one term if he's elected, while DeSantis can serve two. I mean, right there ought to be game, set, match. But my guess is that Republicans are going to make the wrong decision here, and they might make the wrong decision quite demonstratively.
Yeah, and as you pointed out too, it's interesting how these Trump cultists, at the same time, they see Trump as Superman and invincible, but at the same time they talk about how he was victimized by Fauci and the news media and all this stuff. I mean, so which is it? Is he Superman or is he a victim? They can't seem to make up their minds on that either.
That's one of many, many, many examples of illogical thinking on the part of the Trump cult. I mean, yeah, I mean, and it's not just with Fauci, but all sorts of things. I mean, they make him out to be a Superman and a alpha male and a brilliant guy. And oh, by the way, yeah, he was duped here and he was weak here and he got taken advantage of here and he's a victim here. I mean, I can't begin to understand it. I just know it exists, and I know that if it's in a large enough portion of the population, it basically prevents Joe Biden from being defeated in 2024, whether it's by Trump or by DeSantis, because if DeSantis happens to somehow win the nomination, I'm convinced the nomination will basically be worthless because so many of Trump's fans will have already been convinced that DeSantis is a terrible guy.
Yeah, I don't understand that. And actually, I think I really would like to see DeSantis stay in Florida because it seems like he can probably do more there anyway. But I don't know who would run. And there's always the possibility that some major medical event will happen with Biden too. I don't know how much of a factor that would be, but that could certainly impact.
Well, to me, I have said many times that unless one or both of them becomes physically incapacitated, we're headed for Trump Biden, and that Biden will very likely win that battle. Now, both of them are old enough to where physical incapacitation is certainly very much a possibility. And I think we're seeing that with Gavin Newsom trying to basically run a semi-presidential campaign just in case, if an emergency, break open the Gavin Newsom presidential campaign. And so I think he's not a smart guy, but that's a pretty smart thing to do because there's I don't know what it is, 1 in 10, 1 in 8 chance that something really bad happens with Joe Biden in the next year. And if that happens,
yeah,
the Democrats are going to.
And he also puts his name out there, so if he wants to. Yeah. And he also puts his name out there, so if he wants to run again in 28 or 32, people will know he's there. So, yeah. And he certainly, yeah. Where do you think the American conservative movement goes from all this? What's it going to look like in 5 or 10 years?
Well, there is no American conservative movement. It doesn't exist. It's dead. It's over. So there's people who call themselves conservatives, but it's over. I mean, there's what we found out was that there really was no conservative movement, that it was basically all a fraud, and it was based in being anti-democrat. And I remember even kind of wondering how it is that the conservative movement held together. This is before Trump. And I remember thinking the only thing that all these factions really have in common mostly is pro-life. In other words, the pro-life movement was the only part of the conservative movement that was really hardcore and passionate and consistent about what it is they believe. And by the way, now that Roe v. Wade has been repealed, even that now, as I think we saw in the 2022 midterms, that value has kind of dissipated, I guess, because the other side is more energized on the issue now. And but there is no conservative movement. I have no idea what conservatism is in the modern Republican age. I mean, conservatism is whatever Donald Trump says it is on that day. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, there's no more limited government. There's no more no concepts of freedom and the Constitution and all these other things that used to be part of conservatism. I don't even know what the heck our stance on Russia is supposed to be anymore. So there is no conservative movement. It's over.
Yeah. I think for a long time it was just, defined by opposition to the Soviet Union. And also it lately seems to be unified by wanting to build a border wall.
Well, the border wall is never going to get built. And Trump promised it 1,000 times and did almost nothing with it. So even though he had a Republican House and a Republican Senate.
Yeah, and I'm actually horrified. Yeah, And actually, I'm horrified by that because I think a border will be used to keep us in. So, but
who knows?
but and at least after the World Trade Center, there was at least unity around let's go spend as much money on the military as possible. Well, it looks like we're at about an hour now. You got anything else you want to say before we go, and tell us where you are where we can find you on the net?
Well, the best place to find me is our podcast, which is The Death of Journalism. I also did another true crime podcast called With the Benefit of Hindsight with Liz Habib, which is epic, and people should check that out. But on a twice a week basis, I put out The Death of Journalism, and you can find that at iTunes, and Spotify, Spreaker, I'm sure other places where you get your podcasts. And I'm on Twitter at Zigman Freud, Zigman Freud, on Twitter.
Yeah, Zigman Freud. And I really loved your tribute to Franco Harris. That was, as a lifelong Steeler fan, that was beautiful. I mean, I don't know anybody out there who didn't like Franco. So
he was a heck of a guy. I got to know him very, very well. I miss him terribly. The timing of it was terrible. It was a very depressing moment for me, and it changed pretty much the way I view a lot of things going forward. It took away a lot of the reason why I do what I do. Not to overstate it, but I think it'll be a lot easier, which I might do pretty soon, especially given the status of the 2024 Republican race, with Trump looking like he's probably going to be the guy. Franco passing away will make it a lot easier for me to just drop out of public life, because at least I won't feel like I'm letting him down. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but Franco was an amazing guy, and I miss him a lot.
Well, thank you. Please hit like and subscribe, and go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. It's out there on all the sites. I'm Chris Baker. This is the Fountainhead Forum. We are out. Thank you for coming on, John. Have a good day.